Hey everybody, I'm Jeanette, a self-professed true crime nerd, and welcome to the Law and Murder Podcast, where we're going to be talking about true crime and exonerations. You ready? Let's get started. Hey everybody, welcome to the new episode of the Law and Murder Podcast. This week's episode is going to be on Anthony Ray Hinton. If you want to read more about him, he did write a book. It was Oprah's book club pick, I want to say around this time last year. So if you want more of his personal account of his time in prison, that is definitely a great place to go and get all of your personal information about Anthony. I'm pretty sure he's been on a couple podcasts too and interviews with Oprah, so I highly suggest going and watching those things and reading his book or listening to it if you like audiobooks. I have the audiobook and I really liked the narrator that he picked for his book. Today I'm going to stick as close as I can to the facts of the case and how he got out and kind of summarize that for you guys. I hope you enjoy. Have you ever watched one of those movies where all these lives collide into everyone knowing everyone? This case is somewhat like that, except the one guy gets thrown into a storm and no one really knows how he got there to begin with. On February 23rd, 1985, in Alabama, Mr. Davidson was closing up his restaurant for the day. He was closing out the books and getting ready to make his deposit to the bank and go home after a long day at the store. As he was going to the parking lot, he encounters a man who holds out a gun and has him walk back into the restaurant. Mr. Davidson obliged, hoping that this kid just wanted money and that he would leave. He walks back into the store, unlocks the door, and goes into the back where the safe is. Mr. Davidson turns on the light and opens the safe for the man. The man takes $2,100 in cash and then tells Mr. Davidson to get into the cooler, and as Mr. Davidson turns around to do so, the robber unlocks his weapon and shoots Mr. Davidson in the head by his right eye and 7 inches from the top of his head and leaves the scene of the crime. Thomas Elliott was going about his business, going into the fast food joints and getting the bugs out. He was an exterminator by trade. And he waits until these places close before he goes in and does his job. He's all about his routine, and Thomas pulls into the parking lot and notices a car, but didn't think anything of it. Sometimes the managers stay late to finish up some business that they can't during the workday. So he steps out of the car and grabs the supplies needed to do the job, and as he's walking across the parking lot and grabs his keys to unlock the restaurant, he noticed that the door was already unlocked. He found it kind of odd, but again, assumed the manager was in there, and why would he lock it back up if the store was most definitely closed? When he walks into the restaurant, he sees a light on in the back, so he walks to the back of the office to let the manager know that he's there, and what he comes upon will never leave his memory. On the floor in a pool of blood is the store manager, Mr. John Davidson. He quickly looks around and sees that Mr. Davidson's false teeth were on the floor and there's blood on the door of the restaurant's cooler. Thomas runs over to see if Mr. Davidson is okay, and Mr. Davidson gets up off the floor and starts walking, almost zombie-like. This creeps Thomas out, so he calls 911 and then waits in the parking lot for the ambulance to arrive. Minutes later, the ambulance and the police arrive at the scene. The police find no evidence at the scene. This guy knew what he was doing. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses, and the restaurant was right by the highway for a quick escape. The police recovered the bullets from the restaurant and went out to Mr. Davidson's car with no luck for evidence either. All that was left was his wallet and his keys in the car. Mr. Davidson was taken to the hospital, but 2 days later he passed and the case would go cold. It wasn't until July 1st that same year things would pick up again. At Captain D's, another manager was getting ready to close up his shop after a long day at work. It was 11:30 in the evening and an exhausted Mr. Vason was ready to go home and go to sleep. The manager had left for the night, telling him to make sure to call corporate with the day's earnings and then lock up and enjoy his evening. At 12:45 in the morning, Mr. Vason had finally finished closing up the store and called corporate and was more than ready to get home. As he was walking to his car, he encountered a man with a gun that told him to go back into the restaurant. He again obliged, hoping to save his own life. He goes into the restaurant, unlocks the safe for the robber, and gives him $650 in cash. The man then tells him to go into the cooler, and when he does, the robber shoots him on the cheek and another shot to his head. He is left for dead, and sometime between the hours of 12:30 and 2:30, Mr. Vason passes away. At 7:45 the following morning, the manager sees his assistant manager's car in the parking lot and thinks nothing of it. No big deal, right? Well, he walks into the restaurant, and when he goes into the back office and sees that the safe is open, he starts to look around to figure out what happened. And when he opens the cooler and sees Mr. Vason dead on the floor, the manager calls the cops, and when they arrive, they again find nothing but the rounds, just like the last murder that they had investigated. The case would turn out with no leads. The assailant got brave and didn't wait as long this time. Just a little over 3 weeks later, on July 25th, 1985, the night manager of a steakhouse closed up shop at 12:15. He went to the grocery store, and in the grocery store, some of the associates noticed two guys following Mr. Smotherman, the manager. But these two guys were hiding their face. Mr. Smotherman checked out of the store around 12:26 in the morning and went out to his car to go home. He got in the car, turned on the radio, and starts to get out of the parking lot and on the road home. Little did he know that the people that were in the store following him were now following him home. The two guys that were following him bumped into his bumper. So Mr. Smotherman pulls over and gets out of the car to see if there was any damage, and the driver of the car that hit him took the opportunity while Mr. Smotherman was bending over looking for damage, pulled out his gun, and told Mr. Smotherman to get back into his car and drive back to the steakhouse that he just left. They get into the store, and the robber tells him that he needs to open the safe and get him all the bills and change except for the pennies. Mr. Smotherman had caught on to what was happening and remembered hearing the details about this criminal on the news. He knew that he would tell him to go into the cooler, so he asked the killer if he would put him in the storeroom instead, because what the killer didn't know is that the storeroom locks on the inside and no one is able to get in. Mr. Smotherman had the advantage. The robber doesn't care and tells him that's fine, and as Mr. Smotherman gets ready to turn around, he fakes the robber and pushes him out of the way. The robber still manages to fire his weapon and gets Mr. Smotherman in the hand, and another round grazes him on the cheek. With the door locked, the robber could have stayed or left with the money without a trace. After 10 minutes, Mr. Smotherman didn't hear anything and realized that the robber left and it was okay for him to get out and call the cops. There was a bullet that was found in Mr. Smotherman's jacket, and it matched the bullets that were at the other scenes. They now realized that they had to stop this, and the police needed to get all the information that they could from Mr. Smotherman. They did not have any fingerprints or anything else forensically, so Mr. Smotherman and the bullets were all the police had. The police interviewed Mr. Smotherman about the crime and the assailant, and with all the information they gained about the crime, the police were able to complete a sketch. When that sketch was done, they showed it to Mr. Smotherman, and right away he recognized his assailant. When he saw that picture, it reminded him of a man that he worked a second job with named Anthony Ray Hinton. He said that 2 weeks before the robbery, they saw each other, and Anthony asked if the manager at the steakhouse still worked there, and asked what time the store closed. This could have been friendly information, just an exchange about where they worked and, just small talk. But given the trauma that happened to Mr. Smotherman, his brain put these two incidents together and they made sense to him. The police were eager to close the case, so the very next day, based off of Mr. Smotherman's match, they found out where Anthony Hinton lived and made it a point to go there. Anthony Ray Hinton had woken up in the morning and his day was normal, except this day, according to him, he was feeling a bit lazy. We all have those days, right? Anthony lived with his mom, and that morning she had asked him to cut the grass. He tried to get her to be okay with him cutting it the next day, but she wasn't having it, and of course, he got ready and started to cut the grass. As he was cutting the grass, he noticed that a car had pulled up to his home. He stopped the mower and saw that it was the police. The police asked him if he was Anthony Ray Hinton, and he told them that they had gotten the right person. Without question, the police arrested him right there on his lawn. Anthony asked if he could go into his home and tell his mother that he had been arrested and that he would be right back. In his mind, he already had an alibi because he had been at work, and this was simply a misunderstanding. In the home, he was asked if he had a gun, and his mother gave the police the gun that she had in the home. This gun had not been fired in a long time. It was dusty, but it didn't matter. The police had put him in the car, and Anthony at this time didn't know why he was going to jail. In the car, he asked the police why he was arrested, and they told him for 2 counts of capital murder. He told the police that he didn't commit that crime because he was at work. The officer turned around and told Anthony that it didn't matter if he did the crime or not, he was going to be convicted because white cops caught him, the judge would be white, the prosecutor was white, and he would have an all-white jury, and since black people always defended each other, even if they didn't do it, he should take the rap for the murder. All I can say is, wow, the abuse of power is so real here. Obviously, we know that he was released, but the guy that did this is still out there. They focused their attention on Anthony because of what Mr. Smotherman had said, which I get it. You have an eyewitness, he had he was in close proximity of the robber, but it also just they got tunnel vision for it because there was a lack of evidence. And the fact that they had conveniently gotten the gun from Anthony's mother, it's just my opinion that they kind of just fell into this, well, he did it. He said he did it, we have a gun, boom. It all fell into place for the police. But Anthony had his alibi and his manager would later vouch for him, but this did nothing to help Mr. Hinton. He took a polygraph test and passed, but this did not make it to court. The judge wouldn't allow it. Anthony would get a public defense lawyer because he couldn't afford one. This sucks for Mr. Hinton, but having this crappy lawyer is the very thing that would get him out of jail. Wait until you hear what happens, but before I do, I want to throw something out there. It's a quote by Mr. Brian Stevenson, my hero, by the way. This guy's super awesome. I was watching his TED Talk while I was researching this case, and he said something that really caught my attention. He says, "Wealth, not culpability, shapes our outcomes. We have a system of justice that treats you better if you are rich and guilty than if you are poor and innocent. This couldn't be more true. Good lawyers demand more money and the rich get the access to them. Lawyers have to make a living. This is my opinion. You have too expensive of lawyers and then you have public defenders. I know that it can be frustrating to do the same work at the same caliber as a high-paying lawyer, but just because you don't get paid as much doesn't mean that you shouldn't do your job any less than these lawyers that are asking for a lot of money. Maybe if you did great work as a public defender, maybe you'd get paid more. I don't know. I'm ignorant to how lawyers work, but that's just my 2 cents. You took an oath to be honest and to, do the best for your clients. And even though they can't pay you, you should still do the good work. So anyway, Anthony gets to court and here's what the prosecution's got. Mr. Smotherman's testimony, 3 experts to show that the tool marks matched the gun that belonged to Anthony's mother, the bullets found at each of the crime scenes, and their theory is that all of the rounds found came from the same gun, and in turn, all of these crimes are connected. Anthony had his alibi that he was at work and having his manager vouch for him, and he passed the polygraphic exam, but like I said, the judge wouldn't enter that into court. And he also had an expert witness for the rounds that were found at the crime scene. In court, the prosecution's 3 experts would basically say that the tool marks could not conclusively match the rounds to the gun, but they said that it was likely to be the weapon. Anthony had character witnesses, and then it was time for his expert to come up to the stand, and he thought that the gun was not the one used in the crime. Now, here's where the pinnacle of the case happens. The prosecution cross-examines the witness and asked him, or the expert rather, and asked him if he had a vision impairment, and he said that he did. The prosecution asked how many eyes he had, and he said that he only had 1. The prosecution also asked how many cases he had done in the last 10 years. His witness said only 2. And he also confirmed that he didn't know how to use the microscope at the forensics lab and that he had asked for help. This pretty much summed things up for the jury. It was the nail in the coffin, even though they had 3 experts say that they could not conclusively tie the gun and the bullets together. The jury was sold that the prosecution had it right. Anthony was sentenced to death row. When you have a death row case, you're entitled to appeals because it's your life we're talking about here, right? I'm not going to mention all of them, but the most important appeal that Anthony had is his post-conviction hearing. Anthony claimed during his hearing that his lawyer did a very bad job with the expert witness and he could have gotten more money. Anthony said that the expert witness was the reason that he lost his case. At this point, he was working with Bryan Stevenson, and they had 3 experts, which included FBI tool-mark experts and 2 experts from Texas. They had all testified in hundreds of cases, so they knew gun and tool marks that the guns made. All 3 of them could not conclude that the tool marks came from the gun that Anthony had in his home. The state didn't do anything to rebut the testimony of Bryan Stevenson's and Anthony's witnesses, and one of Anthony's experts asked the state's expert how he came to the conclusion that he did in the case when it first went to trial, and that expert refused to cooperate with the court. Anthony's post-conviction petition was denied, and the Court of Appeals in Alabama also denied it when it went up for further appeal to the higher court. Of note, one judge disagreed. The appeals court was at a split decision, and this judge said, and this is in my own words, that Hinton's lawyer sucked, and in his first trial, this judge would have made the lower court find or seek out to find if Payne, Mr. Hinton's expert, was good enough, because no reasonable lawyer would go and hire an unqualified firearms witness. Which, I mean, that speaks volumes because this kind of like goes in repeat again. So after the appeals court denied Anthony's post-conviction hearing appeal, Bryan Stevenson took the case to the Supreme Court, and surprisingly, they took the case. The Supreme Court agreed with the judge from the Alabama Court of Appeals, and the Supreme Court had strictly focused on Payne, the expert. Here's a brief summary of how they came to their ruling. There were 6 bullets, no fingerprints, and no DNA at the scene of any of these crimes. All they had was one witness testimony and the sketch. The biggest argument that was going to be made in court was these rounds and the gun that they got that belonged to Anthony's mother. Hinton's defense lawyer asked the court for money, and he got $500 for an expert witness. The judge told him that he was unsure if he could get more money, but if he needed more money, then he would see about getting him that for his witness. Here's the thing. The lawyer never went back to ask for more money under the assumption that $500 was all he could get. In reality, Alabama does not have a cap on funds used by the defense. All they have to do is show that the money needed was to be reasonably incurred. The Supreme Court quoted one of his appeal hearings showing that the prosecution asked Hinton's lawyer whether he worked hard to secure his witness. He said that he did because it was hard to hire an expert for $500. The prosecution asked his defense lawyer during the same Court of Appeals session if the reason the expert sucked was because of his lack of trying or because he didn't have the money to hire a good expert. And his defense lawyer said that the reason that the expert was terrible was because he didn't have the money to hire a good one. So in their decision, the Supreme Court at this point started in on their judgment. They applied this case, Strickland versus Washington. They said that this case set the precedent for assigning lawyers to those who can afford them in a criminal trial. It says that in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy assistance of counsel. They are entitled to be represented by an attorney who meets the minimum standard. Using this case as precedent, the Supreme Court had to see if Anthony's first lawyer, his original defense lawyer, met the minimum standard at the time of the case, and the majority agreed that no, his lawyer did not meet the minimum standard. They said, in my own words, that it was unreasonable for this lawyer to not seek out additional funds for an expert witness. This case was specifically hinged on expert testimony due to the fact that the only evidence were the 6 rounds and this gun. Rebutting a case would have needed a competent expert. His lawyer knew that too. The lawyer's ignorance to the fact that Alabama would have provided more funds is not Anthony's fault, but the lawyer's, and he should have known, basically, that he could have sought out more funds or figured out a way to do so. The judge had told the defense lawyer that he'd pay more money if he asked, and the lawyer never asked. Again, this isn't Anthony's fault. The lawyer loses on the ignorance of the law, which is unreasonable performance for the defense lawyer. The lawyer loses on the ignorance of the law, which is unreasonable performance for the defense lawyer, and the lawyer knew that the witness was inadequate, but still put him on the stand. The Supreme Court threw everything out and told the lower court, which is the first court that Anthony went to where he was sentenced to death, the Supreme Court told them to start over. The prosecution chose not to pursue the case any further, and Anthony Hinton was released from prison in 2015. Anthony is now a public speaker, and he has his book out, and it's a really good read, and I think everybody should read it, just like I think everybody should read Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. I used to think that all the bad guys went to jail and the police were always right. This is truly not the case. Police are human too, and they make mistakes. Some of them refuse to admit to their fault for the sake of keeping their job, narcissism, or whatever it is. Look at Brendan Dassey and how freaking the state will not let it go. I don't believe that Brendan's guilty. He has no idea what he's talking about. But anyway, police don't always get it right, and neither does the prosecution. And even though I think of Jury of Your Peers is awesome, some people fall into the majority thinking, even though they believe a person is innocent, and some of them won't really fight for it because they just want to go home rather than fight for someone's life. They're only thinking of themselves and not to the duty that was placed on them by the court, or by the Constitution for that matter. Some people are just there because they're ordered there. They didn't listen to anything and daydreamed through the whole entire court case. People are faulty. We are human. There's no perfection in this whole thing. The police get it right a lot of times, and so does the prosecution. But in a case like this, they just got it wrong. And like I said, their tunnel vision and knowing that they got the wrong guy to begin with, or rather their neglect to even open up that conversation and to turn their investigation a different way, they let another man go and get away scot-free with killing 2 people, and who knows how many more people he's killed. I do this podcast because I'm intrigued by the mind and people's personalities and why they do things. I'm also intrigued on how in the world the police get it wrong when most of these exonerations, you can clearly see what the hell. You can see that you had it wrong all along, like right from the beginning. And some of these cases, they knew it and they kept going. I'm intrigued by the fault in humankind, in how people can commit such crazy acts. Why do they snap? I mean, maybe we'll never truly know as a whole, because I do believe that actions are very personal. Like right now I'm reading John Douglas's new book, The Mindhunter Guy. Super awesome, by the way. And it's great. You should read it or listen to it. I don't know. But there was this guy that killed a little girl who came into his house to deliver Girl Scout cookies. And he was mad at his mom because she told him that he couldn't get married like a 30-year-old guy here. His mom was such a dominant figure in his life, and he wanted to get married and she wouldn't allow it, and the white hot rage got the best of him. He killed because he was furious with his mom and wanted control and dominance, and it just so happened that this sweet little girl who just wanted to deliver some cookies was the victim of his rage. Crazy maybe to you and I, but justified to him. And that is exactly why I do this podcast, because I want to know why. What makes people click? When I look at the news or I read a newspaper article, I'm very like, wow, I can't even imagine, right? So anyway, I hope you keep on this journey with me as I go and try to figure out people and throw some psychology and whatever in there. I really enjoy you guys taking the time out of your day to listen to my podcast, to listen to my hobby. This is really hard and it takes a lot of time. So every minute that you dedicate to listening to my podcast, know that when I look at my stats, I'm smiling and I'm thanking you. So thank you so much for listening. And until next time, take care. Hey, I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to the show, and if you love the show, please leave a review on iTunes, and it would be even better if you shared it with your friends and got the word out. Until next time, bye.